September 14, 1944, 11:47 p.m. Medicine Hat, Alberta. The train slowed with a metallic shriek that split the prairie silence. Inside the wooden boxcar, 23 German nurses pressed against the walls, hands gripping whatever they could find. A seam in the timber, another woman's sleeve, the rough wool of their own coats. They had learned to brace for arrivals. Arrivals meant shouting. Arrivals meant dogs and searchlights and the cold barrel of a rifle pressed against the spine until you understood which direction to walk. The door slid open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of diesel and wheat chaff and something else, coffee perhaps or bread. A flashlight beam swept across their faces, clinical and brief. Then a voice, male, steady, speaking accented German. "Ladies, please step down carefully. The platform is uneven. Please." They had crossed an ocean and half a continent expecting orders. The first word they heard was a courtesy. Oberschwester Margaret Klein, 31 years old, had been standing nearest the door. She stepped down first, boots meeting wooden planks that still held the day's warmth. Behind her, the others followed. Nurses aged 19 to 42, captured 3 weeks earlier in Normandy when their field hospital was overrun by Canadian forces advancing through Falaise. They had been tending Wehrmacht wounded in a converted barn when the shelling stopped and foreign voices replaced German ones. No one had fired on them. No one had even raised a weapon. A captain with a maple leaf on his shoulder had walked through the barn, counted heads and said in broken German, "You are now prisoners of war. You will be treated according to international law." International law. Margaret had memorized Geneva Convention articles during training in 1939, back when war was still theoretical. She had not imagined those articles would one day apply to her. The rail journey across the Atlantic had been a Liberty ship called SS Samuel Gompers, 12 days of rolling sickness and salt air and the constant low hum of engines. They had been kept separate from male POWs, assigned a converted cargo hold with cots and blankets that smelled faintly of machine oil. Twice daily, a guard brought soup and hardtack. Once, a British nurse from the Red Cross visited, checked for illness, left aspirin and a box of sanitary napkins. No one spoke much. Speaking required energy they no longer had. From Halifax to Medicine Hat, another 4 days by rail, the landscape changing from dense forest to endless flatness. Through the gaps in the boxcar slats, Margaret watched Canada unspool, small towns with grain elevators, rivers that caught the light like hammered steel, skies so vast they made her chest ache. Germany had prepared them for cruelty. It had not prepared them for distance. Now, standing on the platform under a sky dense with stars, she watched as Canadian soldiers, boys really none older than 25, began unloading their small parcels of belongings. One nurse dropped her bundle. A guard bent to retrieve it, handed it back with a nod. Another soldier was counting heads, marking names on a clipboard, his pencil scratching in the quiet. A truck idled nearby, headlights casting long shadows across the platform. A sergeant stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt, and addressed them in English. A translator, a German-Canadian civilian in a pressed suit, repeated the words in their language. "You will be taken to Camp 132 15 miles west of Medicine Hat. You will be housed separately from male prisoners. You will be assigned work details according to your medical training. You will receive the same rations as Canadian military personnel. Any questions will be answered tomorrow morning after processing." Same rations. Margaret's stomach tightened. For 3 weeks they had eaten whatever the Allies provided, never enough but never nothing. The idea that they might eat what the guards ate seemed implausible. A trick perhaps. A test. The truck ride took 40 minutes, the road unpaved and rough, the nurses bouncing against each other in the covered bed. No one spoke. Fear had a texture. It sat heavy in the throat, tasted metallic, made the fingers cold. When the truck finally stopped and the canvas flap lifted, Margaret expected barbed wire and watchtowers and the flat brutality of a prison yard. What she saw instead, a low cluster of wooden barracks painted white, a flagpole with the Union Jack hanging limp in the still air, and a woman in a Canadian Army nursing uniform standing beside a table laden with tin cups and a steaming kettle. The woman smiled. Not broadly. Just the small, professional curve of someone who had done this before. "Tea, ladies?" she said in English. The translator repeated it. "Hot tea. Milk and sugar if you'd like." No one moved. 23 pairs of eyes fixed on the kettle, the cups, the impossible gentleness of the offer. Margaret stepped forward first because someone had to. She took a cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms, the steam rising into her face, smelling of bergamot and something faintly sweet. She sipped. It burned her tongue. She didn't care. Behind her, the others began to move. One by one they accepted cups, hands trembling, faces blank with disbelief. A younger nurse, Schwester Anneliese Bauer, 19, blonde, still wearing the mud-stained apron she'd been captured in, took her tea and immediately began to cry. Not sobs. Just silent tears tracking down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking as she held the cup like it might disappear. The Canadian nurse stepped closer, touched Anneliese's shoulder lightly, said something soft in English that needed no translation. Anneliese nodded, wiped her face with the back of her hand and drank. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. They had been Sanitätspersonal, medical personnel, assigned to the 12th SS Panzer Division's Field Hospital Unit in June 1944. Most were veterans of the Eastern Front. Margaret had worked in a mobile surgical unit outside Stalingrad in 1942, had amputated frostbitten limbs in temperatures that froze morphine in its vials. Anneliese was newer, trained in Berlin in early 1944, deployed to France just 3 weeks before the invasion. She had never seen combat before Normandy. She had never seen a man's intestines spill into her hands before she learned to push them back and clamp the bleeds and keep working even when her vision blurred from exhaustion. When the Canadians took the hospital on August 19, the nurses had been working for 60 consecutive hours. The barn had no electricity, no running water, no anesthesia left. They had been using vodka looted from a nearby village to disinfect wounds, boiling instruments over a makeshift stove, and praying that the shelling would pause long enough for them to finish a surgery. The Canadian captain who walked in had looked around, at the blood-soaked hay, the rows of wounded men, the nurses still bent over a table trying to save a soldier whose leg was mostly gone, and said one word, Christ. Then he had posted guards at the door, sent for medical supplies and let them finish the surgery. Margaret remembered the moment she realized they would not be shot. A Canadian medic had entered with a box of sulfa powder and plasma, set it on the floor and said in halting German, "Use it. We have more." She had stared at him, this boy in a foreign uniform, and understood that the rules she thought governed war. Brutality answered with brutality, mercy a weakness to be exploited. Were not universal. Some men still followed the Geneva Convention. Some men still believed prisoners were soldiers, not animals. Camp 132 had been built in 1942 to house German POWs captured in North Africa. Mostly Afrika Korps veterans, engineers and support personnel. By September 1944, it held nearly 2,000 men spread across 3 compounds. The nurses were assigned to a separate barracks on the camp's eastern edge, away from the male prisoners, surrounded by its own fence but not isolated. From their windows they could see the main yard, the mess hall, the parade ground where prisoners assembled for morning roll call. The barracks had been scrubbed clean before their arrival. 23 cots with thin mattresses, each made with 2 wool blankets and a pillow. A potbelly stove in the center, already stocked with firewood. Shelves along the walls for personal items. A latrine building 10 yards away with flush toilets and a row of sinks. Hot water even, not much, rationed carefully but available. That first night, Margaret lay awake listening to the others breathe. Some cried quietly. Some prayed. Anneliese, in the cot beside her, whispered, "Are they going to hurt us?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She thought about the tea, the blankets, the Canadian nurse who had called them ladies. She thought about propaganda she had heard, stories of Allied brutality, of prisoners tortured and starved, of women treated as spoils. She had believed some of it. She had prepared herself for some of it. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I don't know why. But I don't think so." Morning came with a knock on the door, not a bang, not a shout, just 3 measured raps and a voice calling, "Breakfast in 15 minutes, please." They dressed quickly, still wearing the uniforms they'd been captured in, and filed out into the cool September dawn. The mess hall was a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. Male prisoners were already eating, seated in orderly groups, the sound of cutlery and low conversation filling the space. The nurses were directed to a separate section near the door, close enough to see the men but far enough to maintain separation. A Canadian soldier handed Margaret a tray. On it, oatmeal with a pat of butter melting in the center, 2 slices of toast, a cup of coffee and an apple. She stared at it. Beside her, another nurse, Schwester Clara Hoffmann, 38, a veteran of 6 years' service, whispered, "This is a mistake." It was not a mistake. Every morning for the next 3 months they received the same. Oatmeal or porridge, bread with butter or jam, coffee or tea, fruit when available. The portions were not generous. Canada was at war, rationing its own civilians, But they were consistent. No one went hungry. No one was punished with reduced rations. The guards ate the same food, sat at the same tables, drank the same coffee. We had been taught to expect starvation, Margaret would write years later in a letter to her sister. Instead, we were given dignity. The policy behind this treatment was not accidental. In 1940, the Canadian government had issued a directive to all POW camp commandants. Prisoners were to be treated in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention, not as an act of charity but as a matter of international law and national character. The reasoning was threefold. Security: well-treated prisoners were less likely to attempt escape or revolt. Diplomacy: Canada held thousands of German POWs, Germany held thousands of Canadian soldiers. Reciprocity mattered. Morality: restraint was civilization. Brutality was easy. Decency required discipline. A memo from the Department of National Defense, stamped October 1942, stated it plainly: prisoners of war are soldiers who have surrendered, not criminals to be punished. Their treatment reflects upon Canada and the Allied cause. Those words shaped every camp in the system, from the officers who designed the routines to the guards who enforced them. Within a week, the nurses began working. Not forced labor, medical duty, same as they had done in Wehrmacht service. The camp had a small infirmary staffed by a Canadian doctor and 2 orderlies, treating everything from minor injuries to chronic illness among the 2,000 prisoners. The doctor, Captain James MacLeod, a Scot from Halifax with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, interviewed each nurse individually, assessed their training and experience and assigned them to shifts. Margaret was placed in charge of the night ward. Annalise assisted with wound care. Clara, who had surgical experience, worked with Captain MacLeod on the rare cases requiring operation. The work was familiar, almost comforting. The routines of checking vitals, changing dressings, dispensing medication restored a sense of purpose that captivity had stripped away. Captain MacLeod treated them as colleagues, not inmates. He asked for their opinions on diagnoses, deferred to their expertise on techniques he was unfamiliar with, and never once raised his voice. When a German prisoner developed appendicitis and required emergency surgery, he invited Clara to assist. She stood across the table from him for 90 minutes, handing instruments, suctioning blood, suturing layers while he worked. Afterward, he thanked her in German, clumsy pronunciation, sincere intent. "You are very skilled," he said. "We are fortunate to have you." Clara, who had not cried since capture, went back to the barracks and wept into her pillow. Daily life settled into rhythm. Morning roll call at 0700, breakfast at 0730, work details from 0900 to 1600 with a break for lunch. Evenings were free. Prisoners could write letters, read books from the camp library, play cards, or simply rest. Once a week, a chaplain visited, offering Protestant and Catholic services. The nurses were allowed to attend, though most did not. Faith had become complicated. Mail arrived irregularly. Letters from home took months to reach Canada, filtered through Red Cross channels, censored by both German and Allied authorities. Margaret received her first letter in November, 3 months after capture. Her mother's handwriting shaky with age. "We heard you were taken prisoner. Are you safe? Please write. We pray for you every night." She wrote back the same day, careful with her words, knowing censors on both sides would read them. "I am safe. I am treated well. I work as a nurse. The Canadians are not what we were told." She crossed out the last sentence, rewrote it. "The Canadians follow the rules." The camp library became a refuge. Someone had donated boxes of books, German novels, technical manuals, even a few medical textbooks. Margaret borrowed a copy of Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, banned in Germany since 1933, and read it in the evenings by the light of the potbelly stove. Annalise discovered a collection of poetry, Rilke, Goethe, Heine, and copied verses into a notebook she kept under her pillow. There were tensions, of course. Some nurses refused to trust the Canadians, convinced the kindness was temporary, a prelude to something darker. Schwester Ilse Wagner, 42, a hard woman with deep lines around her mouth, spoke openly about her loyalty to the Führer, her belief that Germany would still win, that their capture was a temporary setback. She refused to smile at the guards, refused to say, "thank you," when handed her food tray, refused to cooperate beyond the minimum required. Most of the others simply tried to survive. They worked their shifts, ate their meals, wrote their letters, and avoided thinking too hard about what the war had become. In late October, a new prisoner arrived, Schwester Erika Schultz, 26, captured near Aachen during the German retreat. She was gaunt, feverish, and covered in lice. Captain MacLeod quarantined her immediately, treated her for typhus, and assigned Margaret to monitor her overnight. Erica, delirious with fever, spoke in fragments. About the hospital where she'd worked, bombed twice in 1 week. About the soldier who died in her arms while she sang him a lullaby because there was no morphine left. About the Canadian medic who had found her hiding in a cellar, given her water, and carried her to safety on his back. "He didn't have to," she whispered, eyes glassy. "He could have left me." Margaret wiped her forehead with a damp cloth. "Why didn't he?" Erica smiled faintly. "I asked him. He said, because you're a nurse." That story circulated through the barracks like a small fire. Some dismissed it. Some let it sit quietly in their minds, a counterpoint to everything they'd been taught about the enemy. December brought the first snow. The prairie turned white and silent, the wind cutting across the flat land like a blade. The camp prepared for Christmas with a strange, cautious optimism. The male prisoners decorated the mess hall with paper chains and pine boughs. Someone built a small tree from scrap wood, painted it green, hung it with ornaments fashioned from tin cans. The nurses were invited to the Christmas Eve service. Most attended, more out of boredom than belief. The chaplain, a gentle man from Ontario, read the nativity story in English, then German, then led them in singing Still Nacht. 2,000 voices, prisoners and guards together, singing the same hymn, the same words, the same melody. For 3 minutes and 42 seconds there was no war. Afterward, the camp commandant distributed Red Cross parcels. Chocolate, cigarettes, condensed milk, playing cards. The nurses received theirs in the barracks, sitting in a circle around the stove. Annalise opened her parcel slowly, reverently, and pulled out a bar of Swiss chocolate. She broke it into 23 pieces, one for each woman, and they ate in silence. "That chocolate tasted like forgiveness," Annalise would later tell an interviewer. "Not because we deserved it. Because someone believed we were still human." If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The guards were a rotating cadre of Canadian Army personnel, most too young for frontline duty or too old to deploy. Private Thomas Bennett, 19, a farm boy from Saskatchewan, worked the night shift guarding the women's barracks. He spoke almost no German, but he learned a few phrases. "Good evening, sleep well, is everything all right?" He brought them firewood without being asked. Once, when the stove malfunctioned and filled the barracks with smoke, he stayed for 2 hours helping them ventilate the room, disassemble the flue, and clear the blockage. Margaret asked him, through the translator, why he was being so helpful. He looked confused by the question. "It's cold," he said. "You need heat." She tried again. "But we are the enemy." He shook his head. "You're prisoners. That's not the same." The distinction seemed obvious to him. To her, it was a revelation. Corporal William Fraser, 34, a fisherman from Nova Scotia, worked the day shift. He had a habit of showing photographs, his wife, his 2 daughters, his fishing boat. He didn't speak much, but the photographs said everything. "Look, here is what I am protecting. Here is why I am here. Here is what normal life looks like." Schwester Clara, looking at a photo of Fraser's youngest daughter, asked quietly, "How old?" 7, he said. Clara's own daughter was 8. She had not seen her in over a year. She handed the photograph back carefully as if it might break. Fraser nodded, tucked it into his breast pocket, and walked away. That night, Clara wrote a letter to her daughter. She did not know if it would reach her. She did not know if her daughter was still alive. She wrote anyway. Not all interactions were gentle. Some prisoners tested boundaries, probed for weaknesses, tried to manipulate the guards. Some guards were suspicious, distant, unwilling to see the prisoners as anything but the enemy. But the structure held. The rules held. Morning roll call, work details, meals, lights out. Routine became trust. Trust became something almost like peace. In March 1945, news of the war's progress filtered into the camp through guarded conversations and smuggled newspapers. Germany was collapsing. The Allies were crossing the Rhine. Berlin was being encircled. The male prisoners received the news with varying reactions. Some denial, some relief, some quiet despair. The nurses, isolated from the men, heard only rumors and whispers. Ilse Wagner, the hardliner, stopped eating. She lay in her cot staring at the ceiling, refusing to speak, waiting for something: rescue, vindication, death. Margaret sat beside her one evening, not saying anything, just sitting. After an hour, Ilse spoke. "We were right, weren't we? The party. The cause. We were right." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She thought about the barn in Normandy, the soldier whose leg she couldn't save, the Canadian medic who brought sulfa powder. She thought about Private Bennett bringing firewood. She thought about the chocolate on Christmas Eve. I don't know anymore, she said finally. I used to think I knew. I don't. Ilse turned her face to the wall. She started eating again 2 days later. On May 8, 1945, the camp commandant assembled all prisoners in the main yard and read a prepared statement in English, then German. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. All prisoners of war will remain in custody pending repatriation arrangements with the occupying authorities. There was no cheering. No celebration. Just silence, heavy and vast, settling over 2,000 people who no longer knew what they were. The nurses returned to their barracks and sat in the gathering dusk. No one spoke. Anneliese was crying again, not from grief, not from relief, just from exhaustion. Margaret put an arm around her shoulders and held her while the light faded. Repatriation took months. Most German POWs in Canada were not returned until late 1946 or early 1947, pending security clearances and logistical coordination with the Allied occupation authorities in Germany. Some prisoners chose to stay. By 1947, approximately 6,000 German POWs had applied for Canadian residency, unwilling to return to a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Of the 23 nurses at Camp 132, 17 returned to Germany between 1946 and 1947. 4 remained in Canada, marrying Canadian civilians or soldiers they met during processing. 2, Margaret Klein and Anneliese Bauer, stayed in Alberta, working as nurses in civilian hospitals, eventually becoming Canadian citizens. Margaret never spoke publicly about her time as a POW. In private letters she wrote carefully, aware that memory distorts and sentiment simplifies. But one phrase recurred: "They treated us like soldiers, not like women." That was the greatest kindness. Anneliese, in a 1982 interview with a local historian, was asked what surprised her most about her captivity. She thought for a long time before answering. "The tea," she said. "That first night. We were so frightened. And they gave us tea." She paused, looking out the window at the prairie. The same endless flatness she had seen from the boxcar in 1944, now familiar, now home. "We asked the guards, are all Canadian men like this? Gentle, polite. We couldn't believe it. They just laughed and said, we're not special. This is just how it's done." She smiled faintly. That was the answer. This is just how it's done. Restraint. Decency. Not because it was easy. Because it was the rule. In 1989, Camp 132 was demolished. The barracks were torn down, the fences removed, the land returned to agricultural use. A small plaque was installed near the site, listing dates and statistics. Number of prisoners, years of operation, nothing more. No names. No stories. Margaret Klein died in 1991, age 78, in a hospital in Lethbridge. Her obituary mentioned her nursing career, her volunteer work with the Red Cross, her 2 children and 5 grandchildren. It did not mention that she had been a prisoner of war. She had asked that it not be included. The past was past. But in her personal effects, her daughter found a small box. Inside, a tin cup, dented and tarnished with Canadian Army stamped on the base. A dried sprig of pine from the Christmas tree in 1944. A photograph of Private Thomas Bennett standing beside the barracks, smiling awkwardly at the camera. And a letter, never sent, written in careful English. "Dear Canada, you gave me tea when I expected chains. You gave me work when I expected punishment. You gave me dignity when I expected shame. I do not know if I deserved it. I only know that I will never forget it. With gratitude, Margaret." If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew about war and mercy, subscribe, because history's deepest truths are hidden in its smallest gestures, and we're here to find them together. The boxcar door had opened in darkness. A voice had said, "Please." 23 women had stepped down onto a platform in a country they did not know, expecting brutality, receiving tea. That single moment, courtesy extended where none was required, had rewritten their understanding of the enemy, of the war, of themselves. Restraint is not weakness. Decency is not naivety. The hardest discipline is not cruelty. It is kindness under pressure, dignity given freely, rules followed when breaking them would be easier. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy.